let's move to a totally different topic. This guy is so brilliant, as you guys can see, all this knowledge from off the top of his head, and he's not using any notes. Let's move into the finances, because, folks, he has a master's in finance. He is an economist. He's a professor in economics. He has a daily show, by the way, at worldviewtube.com. So if you're enjoying how articulate and smart he is, there it is. If you didn't notice, he's on worldviewtube.com.
YouTube, here I am. Eastern Financial Report. Let me take my tinfoil hat off and put on my academic
There you
hat.
go. There you go.
But I wanted to segue into economics by your comments about our leaders in Congress. And we wonder why they're so naive with respect to elections. Well, first of all, they're elected. You know, how could the system be wrong? I'm elected. I'm certainly legitimate. But these are the same people that have run up a $35 trillion deficit. Okay? When World War II ended in 1945, the deficit was 100% of our GDP, our gross domestic product. It took 30 years to go from 1945 to 1975 to pay that debt down to 25% of our GDP. It took 30 years. And we did that with a 90% marginal income tax rate above a certain dollar amount. And that's why the CEO of a company would live down the block from a plant manager at the company, because above a certain income level, 90% went to Uncle Sam to pay off the debt. Brought it down 25%. Well, since 1975, we are now at $35 trillion in debt. It is now 129% of our GDP. Larger than when we just finished World War II with all of the expenses. This is where we are today in relative peacetime. And then what these guys did, if you were watching last year, they kicked the can down the road because the government's going to shut down on Friday if we don't pass these continuing resolutions. Well, they kicked the can in November and December and January. Well, then now in end of February, they passed a spending bill that runs through September 30th of this year, the end of the federal fiscal year, $1.2 trillion deficit. You add that to the 34 back then, it's 35.5 trillion deficit. And what that means is they passed the $1.2 trillion spending bill and they borrowed all the money. They don't have it because our tax base is about 52% of the federal spend right now. So they have to sell bonds into the bond market, and then, you know, people buy the bonds, and then Janet Yellen collects the money, allocates it to the departments, and the money gets spent. These people in Washington are clueless. They have no idea that the 165 million Americans who actually pay taxes, which 330 million Americans, add the 10 million that snuck in, but they don't pay taxes. They don't earn any money right now. You've got 165 million Americans paying taxes, and they have the burden of 35 trillion in debt. They are spending way beyond the American taxpayers' base and ability to fund that level of spending. But they keep going, and the deficit gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, this has become a problem because the International Monetary Fund has now said, that's not sustainable. Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, that's not sustainable. The president of the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank, that's not sustainable. Warren Buffett, that's not sustainable. Mr. Diamond, the president of the largest bank on earth, that's not sustainable. Everybody in the private sector and even in the quasi-private banking sector is saying this is unsustainable spending. And they don't care, because they think that money is infinite. And you know what? They're right, because what we started out with a Federal Reserve System that was supposed to protect the private banking industry from collapse. And they were given a very special power to be able to print money. The only place on earth you can print money legally, and they have that special. Congress has figured out that no matter how many bonds they sell, the Federal Reserve will step in and sop up the excess bonds to keep the interest rates stable within the bond market, and it's infinite money. It's just like the Federal Reserve president in the Twin Cities has said, the Federal Reserve has infinite money. Well, Congress has figured that out. So you want $95 billion for Ukraine? No problem. It's infinite money. But they keep selling the debt, and they put our Federal Reserve in this terrible position of having to buy this debt, put it on their balance sheet. That's what's called quantitative easing, in order to keep those bond market interest rates from going nuts. So you've basically, Congress has captured the Federal Reserve, has captured the banking system. The 165 million Americans, we aren't covering half of the federal spending. And the only reason that they don't tax this at 90% is because this is an election year, and who's going to run on that platform? So the point is, the people in Congress are so detached from the limited population. We have 330 million people. The Chinese have 1.5 billion. The East Indians have 1.5 billion. They're like half the world's population. They don't spend money like this. Nobody spends money like this except the delusional people in Washington who think that America is the world's remaining superpower, infinite money, infinite wealth. And we don't. We keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. This is a national security crisis.
Indeed,
it's not just me saying this. It's all these famous people saying, hey, this is not sustainable.
Oh, it's sure not.
You can see it in the inflation.
In fact, speaking of the inflation and what it's doing to businesses and the middle class, which is evaporating quickly, and the low income, we're reading reports, the low income cannot afford, they can't cover their bills. Okay, they can't cover the bills, and I don't know why it is, but I guess a lot of low income folks have a tendency to eat at some of these fast food restaurant chains. And the fact that the low income are now cutting back on how much they're eating at these chains, I don't know if that means they're missing meals, or if it means they've decided they can get a cheaper meal by buying a container of bologna and some white bread. I don't know what they're doing. Macaroni and cheese that is cheaper. They're doing something, because according to some of the polls and surveys, the lower income are cutting out fast food restaurants and places. Now that's starting to have a ripple effect. Then you add what's happening to the middle class. Listen to this guy who is, his stuff today I saw looked pretty good. I want you to respond to this guy. Listen to this.
Recent earnings for McDonald's, Kraft, and Coke confirm that Bidenomics is turning into a two-speed affair, with plenty of wealth at the top and plenty of pain for the rest. Last week, I joined Charles Payne, one of my favorite people at Fox, to talk about it. So McDonald's, Coke, Nestle, Starbucks, and Pepsi have all now flagged that low-income consumers are no longer able to absorb inflation. They're cutting back on visits and they're cutting back on spending, leading to a nationwide drop in traffic and sales across fast food and even basic groceries. McDonald's reported same-store sales are down 3% and transactions dropped 7%, outpacing 4% price hikes to keep up with inflation. Pepsi reported a 5% drop in sales. Nestle dropped 8% for Hot Pockets frozen pizzas and Stouffer frozen dinners. Kraft mac and cheese, Pringles, Pop-Tarts are all sagging. Starbucks is losing the low end altogether, with its stock plunging 14% after turning in lower revenue, transaction, and ticket size while losing fully 1.5 million loyalty reward users. The CEO blamed, quote, macro headwinds, meaning lower-end consumers squeezed by inflation and weak wage growth. Headwind is quite the understatement. In fact, Nestle's chief financial officer estimates the loss in purchasing power among low-income people since Biden took office has come to roughly 50%. It's a whole nother reality on the high end, where sales are doing fantastic. Molson reported strong growth in pricier beers as more consumers, quote, treat themselves. More broadly, the luxury ETF Lux, which includes brands like Hennessy, Hermes, and Ferrari, is actually up 20% in the past 6 months as the wealthy gobble up their Balenciaga and let the poors eat TJ Maxx. In fact, just a few months ago, Lamborghini announced they'd sold 10,000 cars for the first time in history, a third of them in the U.S., and mostly the Urus SUV that goes for $237,000. That's $269 for the performance model with the carbon ceramic brakes with subtle off-white coloring and a watermark. Bentley also reported record sales recently, with Aston Martin and Rolls-Royce close behind. One analyst sums it up as a, quote, K-shaped economy with very different realities for those at the top and those at the bottom, reflected in strong credit card spending at the top, paired with soaring delinquency rates for the rest. So what's next? Brought to you by Unchained.com.
All right, so there we go. What do you make of that? I mean, that's pretty startling.
Yeah, he's certainly rattled off true statistics. I've talked about some of that on my show. As a matter of fact, this morning I noticed that consumer credit card debt is now $1.2 trillion on revolving credit card debt. And this is 18% to 23% to 39% interest on this revolving debt. It's the same number as our federal government is spending between now and September 30th, $1.2 trillion. And they're only paying 4.5%. Okay. So the point is, people are reaching more and more for their credit cards to pay their bills. And this fast food thing is a really big problem because you're right. There are segments of society, we call them, food ghettos or food deserts. And sometimes when people are eating fast food or bags of chips or junk foods, and that's their staple, and these prices continue to go up, this is creating something we haven't seen in America in a very long time. Matter of fact, one can only ask perhaps Marie Antoinette how this turns out, because that's exactly how it's going to turn out. I mean, the last time we had such a divergence in American wealth versus the poor American versus the wealthy American was in the call them the gay 90s. I don't know if you can even say that in this day and age, but it was the 1890s where the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and all these great classic names of the American history, industrial history, were building magnificent mansions on Newport, Rhode Island, and townhouses, and that place in Tennessee, Asheville, Tennessee, whatever. They were building
Asheville, North Carolina.
North Carolina. I know, somewhere down there, north of Florida somewhere. So anyway, the point is that led to the Roaring 20s, which of course led to the collapse in 29 and the Great Depression and the war years. And when we emerged from the war years, not only were we blessed with a new mysterious world government called the CIA, but we entered into the modern period of financial history. And from that point on, America changed. So when we see this amazing dichotomy, 10,000 Lamborghinis sold and Rolls-Royce is doing fine, when most people can't afford a car and groceries, that really suggests that there's a split between the haves and the have-nots that always ends up in some sort of social revolution. I mean, this is what happened in Russia in 1914 and 1918. It's the same thing that happened in Germany when the socialists teed off with the monarchists and the capitalists. That didn't play out really well, and it ended up with Nazi Germany. Whenever you have that kind of a split in American wealth or a country's wealth, you can expect social change. And of course, one of our former presidents was all about fundamentally changing the United States. Well, great. You make us broke. You run up debt that nobody can ever pay off in 3 generations. You pit the wealthy against the poor, which is 90% poor, 10% wealthy, and then you add in all sorts of cultural and racial animosity, and you have a recipe for disaster in this country. And everybody, nobody in Congress sees this. These people are blind. When I talk to my beloved congressional rep, they live in a different world. They think that this is unlimited money, unlimited power. We're the Americans. We can do whatever we want. We don't have the money. We don't have 330 million Americans, 165 million taxpayers cannot afford to build bases on Mars and invade every country that, who's next. We don't have that money.
So let me ask you this, Dan, do you agree with me when I was telling my audience early last year, 2023, I began to tell my audience, we need to get used to the word hyperinflation, not just inflation. Do you agree?
Well, you do. And the sad thing about it is that it's the working class and the poor that are really feeling the pressure. When you look at Milwaukee, 40% of the homes in Milwaukee are owned by private equity. You want to buy a house in Milwaukee and you're poor, you want to get on the ladder and start climbing the ladder, you're competing with gigantic billion-dollar private equity funds that are buying homes to rent to you. You can pay them rent, and when this inflation hits, guess what? The value of those properties are going up. They're capturing the capital gains, not you. You're paying rent receipts, and your rent receipts are not appreciating in value. They're just worthless. This is what we're looking at in the United States. You go all over the Midwest, you see the same thing, that private equity has distorted home ownership, and home ownership was the thing that kept everyone in the 1970s. If you owned a home, inflation was rampant, and you did okay. You came out of it okay. But if you were just renting, you never caught up. You spend your entire life, and here we are in the 20s now. there were the haves and the have-nots. But if you didn't have equity, you didn't have tangible assets and things that go up in value, you were left behind. And this is much worse today than it was in the 1970s.
Wow. And then let's add another equation before we bring in Rebecca Walzer. Let's add another equation, because we know inflation. I mean, you're the guy with the master's degree, you're the professor here, but inflation, too many dollars or too much credit, chasing too few goods and services. Now we're watching.
Think about that.
What's that?
Well, think about that. When the Federal Reserve steps into its open market activities and it goes into the international bond market and it buys federal treasuries to put them on the balance sheet, it prints up the money it uses to buy. And that number in 2020, when Biden was elected, was 3.8 trillion. Today, it's 8 trillion. So It is more than doubled. That's a lot of new money. And if you were Milton Friedman with your monetary theory, you'd say, that's a lot of money in the velocity. That's where the inflation's coming from. And the Fed has to do that, because if they don't step in and sop up that excess, then there's an oversupply of bonds. And when there's an oversupply, the price goes down and the inverse interest rate goes up. And if you get the 10-year treasuries to break 5%, it's about 4.5% right now. If that breaks 5%, that's mortgage rates, car rates, credit card rates. Rates will go through the roof for the consumer, because that's the benchmark. So the Fed, and that's what I mean, they have the Fed captive. The Fed has to step in, and the only way they buy is by creating more money. You pump money into the economy, and it's inflation. We see that when you look at the nominal retail sales in the country. I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Those numbers are up. So, oh, great, sales are up. The economy must be doing well. Those are nominal numbers. When you look at the units of goods and services sold, it's down. People are buying less goods and services for more money, and the media says, oh, look, sales are up. But they don't say units are down, and that's the inflation. That's what you're seeing.
And let's add another thing to the equation. Now, if you have too many dollars chasing too few goods and services, well, one reason we have less goods is because the coronavirus shutdown destroyed a lot of businesses that were producing goods or offering services, right? Now, and of course, we had a lot of money being given out, a lot of money being pumped into the banks, and we had the bank term funding going on, which they've now shut off. And now some of these banks are increasingly getting into trouble with people defaulting on credit cards, defaulting on mortgages, defaulting on commercial buildings, whatnot. And we're being told you're going to see about 900 banks fail over the next 10 months or so. But let's take another part of the equation. How about all the people that are out of the workforce who are not working to help produce those goods or offer those services, which of course is now a bigger problem for the business owner. And the business owner, he is trying to attract qualified employees, and he's having to offer, now there's a smaller pool of people, and supply and demand kicks in, and now you're having to pay more for your employees because there seems to be a shrinking market, a shrinking group of people that either can work, want to work, or that are even alive, because we have what is said to be now millions of people dead. And then you add all those that are injured from the shot. And this has an economic consequence I want you to speak to before we go to Rebecca Walzer. But watch this and respond, please.
Because 17 million people have died on the COVID-19 clinical trials that is reported worldwide. And in one care home, this is what I mentioned in the clip, there was 51 people, and with Health Freedom Ireland and a team of people, we had international statistical analysis. On average, there were 2 deaths in the previous 3 years, so 2 deaths per year. And it was reported in the media that the injections clinical trial enrollment happened to all 51 of those family members and loved ones in the clinical trial on the 21st of January 2021. And 8 of those people died within 48 hours, and there was 19 coffins within 2 weeks. And if that was in January 2021, now we did international statistical analysis to show the correlation of the injection and death was 32 standard deviations, and above 3 is statistically significant. And we sent those to every member of parliament in Ireland and around the world. And if that had been observed by the police the coroners in Ireland and around the world, the clinical trial should have been stopped in January 2021, and those 17 million lives would have been saved. So that's what the clip is about with two Sky One journalists. And I did ask them, had they reported on the adverse events on the clinical trial? And the answer was no.
All right, so again, that gives us an idea on the ground of what's going on, not just obviously with older people, but we have, as we can tell from Dr. Thorpe, Dr. Peter McCullough, many others, myocarditis, pericarditis, we have blood clots, we have strokes, we have heart attacks, we have all these problems. So we have people that have died, they're not here to be in the workforce. We have people that are injured who can't be in the workforce. So tell me in closing how this is creating a perfect storm, because you talk to guys like Ed Dowd, you know, with his mathematician economic background. Ed Dowd will tell you we're in big trouble with all of this converging at one time right now. And then you add in the fact that we have illegals here, and they're protesting in Denver this week and listing to us, they're putting forth what are their demands. We want better food. We want better housing. I mean, they're putting forth their demands. What's that?
So do I. You know, maybe I better go get a sign and go stand on a corner and yell. Maybe I'll get some freebies, you know?
Well,
no, that was an interesting clip, and I think she's right. I grew up at a time, we had just come through the thalidomide crisis in America, where Big Pharma had come up with a drug for pregnant women that was to help them in their labor, with the horrifying consequence that children were being born without arms. And it was terrifying. And as a result of that crisis, double-blind testing was instituted, and it became very difficult to get new pharmaceuticals past the testing, the rigorous FDA testing, and into the marketplace to help people. And that became a political problem. He said, you've overreacted, the rules are too tight. But that's what we grew up with. And right up until this COVID situation, where all of that instantly disappeared overnight. And suddenly they're racing forward with a new type of technology, that the technology, the way this stuff is delivered in the body, is obviously doing things in the bodies of many people. There are horrific reactions, death, disablement. And it just seems that the whole paradigm has shifted, where the fear and the caution of thalidomide is now just basically ignored, because it's so critical to get this type of drug carrier in everyone's body. So you have, you know, if you are prone to be a conspiracy theorist, this is the stuff of which conspiracy theories are made. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing. And of course, if you expand that to look at the number of people who are dying, it's very frightening. This past Christmas, my wife and I attended 2 funerals of young men who died over the holiday, and of course they were fully boosted. These are perfectly healthy young men. They're not in the workforce anymore.
They're not in the workforce.
Their families are devastated.
Wow.
We're devastated. How do you explain that? And this is just my personal experience. You look at this, you know, in Ireland, in Europe, all of the, even what Cuomo was on TV the other day, now apparently he's sick. He couldn't shove these down our throats fast enough back during COVID, and now they're paying the price. So, of course, if you're a conspiracy theorist, you think, gee, maybe somebody's doing this intentionally to wipe out the best and the brightest, you know, and that becomes an economic problem. But in any event, you're losing a lot of bright people, and you're right, labor markets are tough for people with skills, and there are fewer of them. And that's a very sad thing. And I think this is going to come home in a big way. And hopefully people have now, you know, wake up and you say, you know what, I think I'm not going to do that next time. And then what does that do for public health? The way COVID was handled, managed in the United States and globally was a disaster, because a bunch of unelected bureaucrats with power for the first time in their lives are running around, you got to wear a mask, we're going to shut your business down. We saw this in Wisconsin on St. Patrick's Day. Our illustrious governor, when he's not drooling on himself, basically shut down Wisconsin at noon on St. Patrick's Day to keep people out of the bars. And we have a lot of Irish people in Wisconsin who have a good time on St. Patrick's Day. They meant it. And that was a signal. And I'm telling you, the number of Wisconsin businesses that have failed since COVID because of this brutal shutdown was unbelievable. So you're shutting down the economy and you're injecting people with stuff that is ultimately going to kill them. And you know, if you're a conspiracy theorist, you have to raise an eyebrow and wonder what's going on.
Indeed.
And I think that's why the people have to wake up.
Indeed.
Stop sending people to Washington to vote on goofy stuff and bankrupt the country. And you start thinking about who you send to your state capitol and maybe your county courthouse. Very important.
Indeed. And folks, as you can hear from our hour with Professor Eastman, we discovered all kinds of information about voter fraud, the steal, how they might be doing it again, and they, I think, is the deep state intel arena. And then we transitioned into economics. Fascinating conversation. You can, by the way, hear him daily at worldviewtube.com. Tell your family and friends about it. You got just a great example of the quality of his content right there, folks. Worldviewtube.com, the Dan Eastman Show, Professor Eastman Show. Professor, thanks for being with us.
Our pleasure. Good seeing you, Brannon.
You
Have
too.
a blessed evening.
You too, Dan. Great show, folks. That was a great hour. Very informative. We'll have that up pretty quick. We'll do it in two segments. We'll do the segment on the election part, and then we'll cut it into the segment on the economics part. Put them both up at Worldview Tube here in the next 2 hours.